This time on my match fishing memories, I want to talk about catching chub. I grew up in Wareham where we caught dace, a few roach, the odd grayling. That was it as far as match fishing was concerned. Occasionally you might get a gudgeon. Eels didn't even count. And in the early 70s we started to fish the Stour in team matches, Child Oakford against Dorset Stour and Harding's Water, which is near Bear Cross, near Longham Bridge, for matches against Wimborne. We also had the Beaumont Cup, and that was on different venues as well. The Child Oakford Water was mostly about catching a mixture of fish, dace, roach, perch, which were mainly small, but occasionally someone would get one of a pound. The odd small chub, occasionally someone would get a few sort of 12 ounce to a pound ones, very occasionally one of a couple of pounds, but it was all about mixed bags. And at Harding's it was often bleak, a few perch, the odd dace and roach, a few roach in the woods, and that was it. And this all changed when we went there in 1975. I had a pound and a half or so of small stuff. The top weights were all bleak. I think it was sort of £7, £6, £5, all bleak. But we came down to one swim for the weigh-in, and there was a great big willow tree right half across the river, down in the river, and someone was pegged immediately downstream. And behind this willow tree was a shoal of chub. And I think it was a Wimborne guy had drawn there, and he'd got one of them, which was £3 9 ounces. Still remember it after all this time. And I was amazed. I'd never seen anything so big in my life, because fishing on the Froome, like I say, the best roach around that time was about £1.5 pounds. So a £3.5 chub is absolutely monstrous. I know people talk of 6 and 7 pounders and even 8 pounders, but back then that was huge for even for the Stour. And there were 4 pounders coming out in those days, but that was a big fish. I was well impressed. So I went back the following week. I got an exchange book with Wimborne, and I caught the train and then a bus all the way out to Bear Cross. And I fished floating crust, and I got one of those chub, about £2.5 pounds. I was delighted. And then I did a bit of float fishing on another swim, caught a few perch and dace and stuff. And I went back again. I got one of 310s. So that's my biggest ever chub. Absolutely delighted. I think the Stour regulars probably thought I was mad to do that. I mean, getting home was nearly 3 hours because I missed the bus, and then the bus missed the connection for the train. But great big fish, well pleased. And that was the first lesson, that there were certain swims on the Stour where there were resident chub with big snags and stuff like that, and a shoal of chub there that felt safe. And if you drew that sort of swim, that's what you had to try and land. And in the Beaumont Cup that year, we fished a match that included Stour pane, both up above the weir and below. And below the weir, one or two of the anglers had chub. I think the winner had over £8, probably had a couple of chub and some roach. And one angler lost something like 11 chub and blank, which was incredible, fishing down a sort of funnel of pipe reeds, as we call it. And back those days we had fiberglass rods, and using sort of standard Bayer 2.6 hook lengths, and he'd hook them and they're just straight sideways. So these chub flyers did exist. It was getting more exposure to the Stour, starting to learn that if you drew a chub fly, you needed to know how to get them out. And I started to catch a few chub on the Stour and on the Avon as well, around about that time, or a little bit later, 76 or 77. But I still didn't really understand chub. In 1977 we moved venue from Harding's, and we went on to what they called Moys and Tricketts. Moys is now Netherwood Mead, and Tricketts is the water below Julian's Bridge near Wimborne. And I was drawn down near where the bypass is, very close to the river. Back then there was no bypass, you were just under some big trees on a very steady bit of weed-free river, 5-6 foot deep. and I fished a stick float with casters. I had about 3 pounds odd of dace and roach and a few bleak. Just a nice bit of fishing. Came about fourth, I suppose. I can't remember what the winning weights were, what sort of fish or anything like that. But anyway, the following year I drew exactly the same swim, and this time I was at end peg. The pegging must have varied a bit from year to year. No one below me at all, and I thought, well, this will be good. Set up a stick float, fish casters down the middle, nice, very easy fishing, should catch some dace and roach. 2 hours into the match, not had a single bite, and then I noticed way down the river, over 100 yards down the river, these little dimples, and I thought, oh, maybe it's a shoal of bleak. They're not very, they seem to be very big, a very long way down, far further than I can trot. I noticed they were coming up the river, so I just kept feeding. My casters obviously had a few floaters. I might have had some old maggots with floaters in there, and they're floating down, and these dimples are coming closer. And I've still got casters falling through the swim where I'm on my stick float line. And eventually they got to about 30 yards down, and I set up, I must have had 2 fiberglass match rods in those days, set up another rod with a little bleaker float, which are little tiny balsa floats, sort of tapered to a very fine point. They take about 4 number 4, so that you could cast all over the river to catch bleak. So set one of those up with a 16 hook and 2 casters, which seems a bit big for bleak, but anyway, I trotted it on down, fed it down there, and after a few goes, hooked a much bigger big fish. Didn't get any bleak, and I managed to get it out. There were no snags, but it came out like we call them dogs. You just lead them up. He didn't do anything stupid. Massive chub, over 4 pounds. Couldn't believe it. Fantastic. Of course, I carried on doing that for about half an hour, and these dimples had vanished, but I'm still feeding the casters in front of me. And so I went back to the stick float, and in the last hour I picked up 2 more chub, which were both just under 4 pounds. And I ended up with 12 pounds, 3 chub, won the match by an absolute mile. I think a pound of bleak was second. And it was the first big lesson that swim seemed to be devoid of fish at the start, totally devoid of fish. And yet I'd drawn them up from God knows where they were to start with. There was no one below me. Whether the disturbance of us coming down the bank to start with had pushed them down river, they'd sort of turned tail and gone, and then gradually came back. And I think chub do move around. They do look for food. They won't just sit there. You can see them sometimes. They're just sat in one spot. But other times they go up and down the river quite a long way, 50 yards, 100 yards even. And they'll pick up on trails of bait if that bait's going in. So that was that first year of actually getting a chub bag to win a match. The following year we used the same bit of water, and I drew further upstream on a bend with a nice load of willows on the far bank, quite shallow close in, quite pacey with gravel, 3 or 4 foot of water. And I fished a stick float, trotting over towards the willows for 3 hours. Not a bite, not a sign of a fish. You could see the bottom all the way to the willows. And I went for a walk down to Neil Pearson, who was down below me about 100 yards. He hardly caught anything at all. And he walked back with me, and we sat on the high bank, and the bank sloped from the water's edge up to about 8 foot above the water, but a long way back, so it's 10 or 12 yards back. And we'd just eaten our sandwiches or whatever. And Neil said to me, well, what about, I said, oh, there's no fish in this bloody swim. He said, well, what about those 3 chub then? I'm thinking, there weren't 3 chub here before. And there's 3 chub sat right in the middle of my swim, quite happy. They'd been undisturbed for about 20 minutes. And I've put bait in before, so there's obviously some bait down there, some casters. So he went back to his swim, and I set about trying to catch these chub. And they weren't easy. I thought they'd take casters, wouldn't be difficult, but they weren't. In the end, I got 2 bites on a bit of flake on a 16, got one out at 4.5 pounds, lost the other, it got under the roots, and the other one went. So this lesson of the fish appearing is getting reinforced yet again. The year after I got that single chub. I drew on some shallows, not about 2 swims up from that bend, and we fished very, very early in the morning. I think we started fishing at about 6 o'clock or so, and I drew about a foot of water, very fast, very gravelly. Fished a Trent trotter, and in the first hour before the sun came up high enough, I had about 4 pounds odd of dace and grayling. I think I had quite a nice trout as well, which didn't count, of course. But as soon as that sun came up, you could see every pebble, and those fish were not going to come onto that exposed shallows. They just backed off. I don't know where they went, but I couldn't get to them, couldn't find them. Anyway, in the last hour, went and watched Bob Chip chase, a very experienced Wimborne angler who was fishing the next swim down. Very steady swim, about 4 foot deep, hardly moving. With an hour to go, he hadn't had a bite, and yet he's going through, feeding every cast, trotting through, doing as well as he can, and he's just sticking at it. There's no, not giving up, just carrying on. Very experienced on the Stour. With about 30 minutes to go, he gets his first bite, chub of about 1.5 pounds. He said, "Oh, that's a start." Oh yeah, okay. And then with 10 minutes to go, he gets one about 4.25 pounds. So he weighs in 5.12, and he wins the match. I came fourth with my 4.5 pounds. And those chub were probably 2 or 3 swims, probably in that bend that I'd drawn the year before at the start of the match. And they'd gone roving during the match. They've picked up on that trail of feed, and it doesn't have to be very much. It could even be minnows and dace munching casters, just letting the juices dilute into the river. Fish are incredibly sensitive to these tastes and scents, far more than we are. And they've picked up on it, and eventually he's persevered and got that winning catch. Fast forward a few years, and I drew above Julian's Bridge in a club match this time instead of the Intertown. I started off with a stick fly, had a nice swim about 20 odd yards down to the next angler, and then another 20 odd yards to the angler below that, and possibly someone below that as well. And in the first hour or so, I'd got 2 chub for about 6 pounds or so, maybe a bit more, and then the chub, no more chub, and I got about a dozen dace on casters. Mid-match, I switched to maggots. I got another dozen dace, so I've got a reasonable weight, but not enough. You know you're going to need more than that to win. And I kept feeding away, and the anglers below me had just had a few dace, no chub. But I remembered what had happened with Bob Chip chase, and so I kept fishing away. And in that last hour, I got another chub, a bigger one, a 4.5 pounder, and I kept thinking I want one more chub. And with about 10 minutes to go, a chub rolled in my swim, showed in my swim, and I thought, come on, I want that one chub, please, please. And 2 minutes to go, I got that one chub, about 2 pounds, and got 15.12, which was enough to win, and 14 pounds for second. So I think those last 2 chub were in the other swims of the other anglers who'd caught a few dace in the first hour or two, and then basically just stopped feeding. They just sort of can't get a bite, and not really even going through the motions, sort of going for a walk and all the rest of it. And those chub have been in their swims, probably been feeding, but their presentation wasn't good enough to catch them. So they've got the chub present, but they're not catching them. And eventually when they stop feeding them, the chub think, we're still hungry, we've got into the feeding mood, and they've come looking and they've picked up my trail of bait. Another similar match that happened with me was a different lesson, if you like, of fish being in the swim but not catching them. Was a winter league at Longham. The old Christchurch Winter League that they would put on would be below Longham Bridge. There would be a couple of sections, and then at Dudsbury, and then all the way through the tidal from what was the old Throop boundary above Iford Bridge, and then all the way down to Wick. And it was a very, very frosty day in early December. Lovely sun and sunny. Once the sun came up, it was actually quite pleasant and warm, no wind. And I fished a stick float, and I think it was on a size 20 fine wire, and I'm catching a few dace, quite nice fishing. And I started to get these little tiny touches that I couldn't hit. And this went on for about half an hour, and occasionally I'd get a dace, and the dace had fed quite well earlier, at about 20 of them. And it was the sort of day when there were going to be a lot of blanks, so I might not be winning the section, but I've caught some fish. I'm going to get a reasonable section placing. And when I get bites like that, it drives me mad. I cannot tolerate getting bites when I'm not catching fish. And so I put a 22 on, and almost immediately I got a chub, not a big one, about 2 3/4 pounds. And I thought, the chub are there, maybe the chub are there. So thinking, oh, there's chub there, I don't want to be playing chub on a 22. So I switched back to a 20, and I got the odd dace. And a little bit later I started getting these touches again, and I think, I don't know. I go on a 22 again, and I got another chub, about 2 pounds, and a few more dace, and eventually it sort of died. And I weighed in over 8 pounds, and I won the winter. It was a winter league, so I actually won the winter league. And the second weight was only about 6 pounds, because the frost, the tidal water that could fish fantastic in the right conditions with a clear river and a hard frost just didn't fish at all. Very, very hard. And on Longham, the sections there was 1 or 2 good chub, 3 or 4 pounds, but no one put together a bag of fish at all. I forget what was second in my section, probably about 4 pounds. I think the other section was also one with about 4 pounds. And what had happened, and what I didn't realise, is I'd got these 2 chub, possibly more, swimming around in my swim, taking the loose feed, and they're carefully ignoring the size 20 with the single or double maggot on it. And they're giving me line bites, so it's just twitch, little touches one after another, and I'm not really twigging to what's going on. And when I went on the 22, of course, that was enough to fool them and make a difference. One final thing on chub that was interesting was that I've said about fishing against Dorchester up on the Child Oakford water, which they had for many years, but I can't remember when they lost it, but they certainly haven't fished up there for a long, long time. I did twig. It was a hard water. Often 3 or 4 pounds was enough to win. I did win one match up there with about 3.5 pounds. But a different day, I was up there, and I realised that if you could go into your swim very, very quietly, tackle up a long way back from the bank, 20, 30 yards from the bank, and creep in right on the, or put your gear ready before the whistle, but just leave it alone. There was often a little chub on the top, just like this, and you could, if you were really quiet, you could catch that chub first cast. And there was always a chance it'd be a decent one. So that's what I did. I realised there might be a chub in my swim, and I crept in, set all my gear up very quietly, well back, and put it in there ever so quiet. And the pegging was very generous because of the reed beds and the trees, and it just sort of pools and little runs, but big gaps between them. That upper Stour's very much like that. And I went down to the guy at the next swim, who was 60 or 70 yards from me. And I said to him, do you ever catch any chub in the matches? He said, oh, I've never ever had a chub in a match on it. Okay. And with that, he got a bank stick and he smashed down all the rushes in front of him. Instead of going in quietly, he made sure he was never ever going to see a chub. First thing he did was scare the living daylights out of them, and they never ever came back. So chub they are a very cautious fish, and you need to be cautious if you want a chance of ever catching them. And if you don't scare them, you've got a chance. Hope I've given you a little bit of food for thought about catching chub in matches. I will come back to chub in other matches when I talk about winter leagues or nationals and other things in other episodes. Until then, it's goodbye for now.